Some stories are hidden in plain sight. You walk by them unaware of the secrets they carry. This is one of those stories. A family's legacy, long-standing and full of pride, shattered in ways no one could have predicted. It began with something so ordinary. A family visit. Two teenage boys, sent to spend a few weeks with their grandmother while their parents were away. A chance to reconnect, to share memories, to simply be together. But in that house, something else was waiting. Something no one saw or anticipated. Viva Evans had been alone for years. Her husband gone, her children grown. Her home now quiet in ways that unsettled her. But she never expected this. She never imagined that the reunion she had longed for would lead to something far more complicated. And when her grandsons, Caden and Kieran, stepped through her door, everything changed. First, it was calm and gentle. A shift in the air, a discomfort that was easy to dismiss. But as the days passed, the tension grew. Things that should have been simple, shared meals, casual conversations became something else. Something that made Viva question everything she thought she knew about family, about herself. Caden and Kieran, the twin grandsons she hadn't seen in years, were no longer the boys she remembered. They had grown into young men, bold and confident in ways that made her uncomfortable. But she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was their presence, or perhaps it was something deeper. 2 weeks. That's all it was supposed to be. 2 weeks together and then life would return to normal. But sometimes, 2 weeks can change everything. Sometimes, what seems innocent can quickly become something far more dangerous. Her grandmother, her grandsons, and a secret that tore them apart. So, what happens when the lines we trust are crossed? When the ties that bind us unravel in ways we never expected? This is the story of a family and the secret that would tear them apart. A secret that should have never existed. Trust, love, family. How far can they be stretched before they break? And when they do, who is left to pick up the pieces? Stay with us, because this is where the nightmare truly begins. Viva Evans. A name once spoken with pride. A woman known for her resilience, for her strength. Now, in her late 60s, Viva has lived a life full of love, loss, and most recently solitude. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when her home was alive with the sounds of laughter and conversation. A time when she was surrounded by family, friends, and the man she loved most in this world, her husband Jonas. For over a decade, Viva has lived in the shadow of her husband's absence. Jonas was her rock, the one person who made everything feel steady, no matter how turbulent life became. They had built a life together, one filled with memories, children, and eventually grandchildren. But when Jonas passed away, something shifted in Viva. The home they had once shared became quiet. Too quiet. Viva had been raised in a strict household, a place where morality and family values were instilled from a young age. Her parents had taught her to always put family first, to honor those bonds, and to live with integrity. She had carried those lessons with her all her life, through her marriage, raising her children, and even now as a grandmother. But as the years dragged on after Jonas's death, that once firm sense of right and wrong began to blur. Loneliness is a powerful force. It sneaks in quietly at first, just a whisper in the back of your mind. But then, as the days turn into weeks, and the weeks into years, it becomes louder. It becomes harder to ignore. Viva's once vibrant social life had withered away, and she found herself spending most of her days alone, in a house that felt far too big for one person. And in that solitude, her longing for companionship grew. And so did her vulnerability. But then came the visit. A chance to break the cycle of loneliness, if only for a short time. Her grandsons, Caden and Kieran, were coming to stay with her. She hadn't seen them in years, not since they were boys. Now, at 17, they were young men. Twin brothers, identical in appearance, though each with their own distinct personality. Caden and Kieran Evans. Athletic, mischievous, sons of diplomats. They had been raised in a privileged home, with all the opportunities that life could offer. But with their parents often away on assignments, the twins had grown up faster than most. They were used to having their independence, used to pushing boundaries. And when they arrived at their grandmother's house, they brought that same boldness with them. Alicia and Devin Evans had built their lives around diplomacy. A life of travel, duty, and constant assignments. They were used to being apart, one of them leaving for a time while the other stayed behind to manage things at home. But this time was different. A special assignment had come up. One that required both of them to be overseas, away from their sons for 2 weeks. It wasn't ideal, but they had done it before. Alicia and Devin Evans had done it before, leaving the boys with friends or trusted caregivers. But this time, there was only one option. Alicia's mother, Viva. The grandmother who hadn't seen the boys in years. On the surface, it seemed perfect. A chance for the twins to reconnect with the woman who had played such a big role in raising Alicia. A chance for Viva to break out of the isolation that had haunted her for so long. But Alicia, she wasn't so sure. There was hesitation, a part of her that worried. She trusted her mother, but there was something about leaving her teenage sons with Viva for an extended time that made her uneasy. Viva and Alicia had always had a complicated relationship. The kind of mother-daughter bond that was both close and distant at the same time. They loved each other deeply, but there were things left unsaid. Years of tension buried beneath polite conversation. Viva had been strict, maybe too strict, while Alicia was growing up. She had instilled in her daughter the same strong moral values she had been raised with, but now, years later, Alicia sometimes questioned if that strictness had left scars. So when the opportunity came to leave the boys with her mother, Alicia hesitated. She knew her mother loved the twins, but there was a small voice in the back of her mind telling her this wasn't the right choice. Something about the timing, about the boys' age, about her mother's long years of loneliness. But in the end, the choice was made. It was supposed to be good for everyone. Time for Viva to bond with her grandsons. Time for Alicia and Devin to focus on their work. She convinced herself it was the best decision. Alicia and Devin left on their trip. Their sons, Caden and Kieran, settled into their grandmother's home. It was only 2 weeks, after all. What could possibly go wrong? But Alicia had no idea that in those 2 weeks, her family would be changed forever. Viva was excited. More excited than she had been in years. The chance to see her grandsons again, to have them with her in the house, felt like a gift. She had missed them so much, and the thought of spending time with them filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. But when she saw them, really saw them, something inside her shifted. The boys were no longer the small children she had once cared for. They had grown into young men, tall, strong, confident in their bodies in a way that took Viva by surprise. It wasn't just their size. It was the way they carried themselves, the way they seemed so comfortable in their skin. They walked around the house as if they owned it, lounging in tight, revealing clothing, their bare chests on display. At first, Viva didn't know how to react. She told herself it was nothing, that it was normal for boys their age. But the discomfort was there, gnawing at her. She asked them to cover up. She tried to set boundaries, but the boys didn't seem to listen. They shrugged it off and continued lounging around the house in the same way. Viva told herself it was just boys being boys, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. She felt something she wasn't ready to confront. It had been over 10 years since her husband had passed away. 10 long years of solitude, of sleeping alone in a bed that once held two. Viva had done her best to stay strong, to keep herself busy. But loneliness has a way of creeping in, of filling the empty spaces in your life until it's all you can feel. And now, with her grandsons in the house, something she had long buried began to rise to the surface. First, it was just a thought, a fleeting moment of recognition, acknowledging that her grandsons had grown into attractive young men, that they were no longer the children she remembered. But as the days passed, that thought began to grow, to fester. Viva couldn't stop it. She tried to push it away, but the more time she spent with the boys, the harder it became to ignore. There were moments, small moments, that made her question herself. The way they looked at her, the way they smiled, the way their bodies moved. It was all so casual, so innocent, but to Viva it felt different. She could feel her own discomfort, her own attraction growing, and it terrified her. This wasn't right. These were her grandsons. But the loneliness was stronger than she realized. As the days passed, Viva found herself caught in an internal battle. She wanted to be the loving grandmother, the one who cared for her grandsons, who bonded with them in a way that only family can. But the longer they stayed, the more conflicted she became. She didn't want to admit it, but she could feel the lines between right and wrong beginning to blur. And with every passing day, the weight of that conflict grew heavier. She didn't know how to stop it. She didn't know if she even could. And as she watched her grandsons move through her house, so confident, so carefree, she couldn't help but wonder, was it too late? Had something already shifted between them? The answer was coming, and it would change everything. It was a warm evening, the kind that made the house feel almost too quiet. Viva sat in her chair, trying to read, but the words on the page blurred. As her mind wandered, she could hear them in the next room. The twins, Caden and Kieran. Their laughter echoed through the house as they wrestled playfully. It was a sound she used to cherish. The sound of youth, of life filling the home. But now, as she listened, it stirred something else in her. Something she couldn't quite understand. Something she didn't want to. She glanced toward the living room where they tussled. Their young bodies moving with a confidence that made her uneasy. They had grown so much since she had last seen them. No longer boys but young men. Tall, strong, and full of energy. Their bare skin glistening from the heat of the evening caught her eye. She tried to look away, tried to focus on the book in her hands, but her gaze kept drifting back. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop watching. Viva felt her chest tighten with guilt. These were her grandsons. She had raised them, loved them, and yet here she was, unable to shake the discomfort growing inside her. It was as though a line had been crossed. But not by them. It was her. She was the one who had let her mind slip into a place it had no right to be. She told herself to stop, to get up, to leave the room. But her legs felt heavy, rooted to the floor. Her eyes still fixed on the scene before her. The boys, unaware of the storm brewing in their grandmother's mind, continued their playful battle. But there was something about the way they moved, something deliberate. Their laughter came easily. Their bodies pressed against each other as they wrestled. But beneath the surface there was a new awareness. A shift. And as the evening wore on, they began to sense it. They began to sense her watching. Viva could feel the air grow thick with tension, but she couldn't tear herself away. She watched as Caden, always the more confident of the two, broke free from his brother's grasp and stood, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His eyes met hers, just for a moment. And in that instant, Viva felt a jolt of something she hadn't felt in years. She didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it, but it was there, and she knew he had seen it too. Kieran, quieter but no less bold, joined his brother, standing tall as they caught their breath. The two of them looked at her, a playful smile still on their faces, but their eyes betrayed something deeper. They knew. They could feel the change in the air, the unspoken tension that had filled the room. And in that moment, the boundaries between them began to blur. The rest of the evening passed in silence, but the weight of what had begun was undeniable. Viva felt it in every glance, in every movement. Her heart raced, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't control. She had lost her way, and deep down, she knew it. But she still clung to the hope that it was nothing, that it could still be undone. But the boys, they had seen too much. They weren't boys anymore, and they knew exactly what to do next. That night, as they sat down for dinner, the silence was almost suffocating. The usual chatter and laughter were gone, replaced by the quiet clink of silverware on plates. Viva could barely look at them, the shame of her thoughts weighing heavily on her. But as the meal went on, she felt a shift. Caden, sitting beside her, moved closer. His leg brushed against hers under the table, and she felt her heart leap in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just an accident. But then he reached out. His hand touched her arm. Soft at first, but it lingered. Viva froze. It wasn't the touch of a grandson to his grandmother. It was something else. Something that sent a shiver down her spine. Her mind screamed at her to pull away, to end this now before it went any further. But she didn't. She couldn't. Her arm remained where it was, his fingers resting gently on her skin. And in that moment, she felt everything she had been trying to suppress come crashing to the surface. Kieran, watching from across the table, noticed the change. He stood up, walking slowly around the table until he was behind her. Viva felt him before she saw him, his presence overwhelming her senses. And then, without a word, he wrapped his arms around her shoulders. It was a gesture that should have been innocent, comforting even. But it wasn't. His body pressed against hers in a way that felt wrong. But she didn't move. She didn't push him away. She couldn't. She had lost control. Everything she had once known about right and wrong, about family and love, had slipped away. And as Kieran's arms tightened around her and Caden's hand remained on her arm, Viva knew that the line had been crossed. This was no longer about family. This was something else. Something darker. Viva, who had spent her entire life upholding the values of morality and integrity, had fallen. Her guilt, her loneliness, her desperate need for connection had led her down a path she could never have imagined. And as she sat there, surrounded by her grandsons. She knew there was no going back. The affair had begun. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and desire. The twins, they had seen their grandmother's vulnerability, but that didn't stop them. They pushed further, testing the limits of what they could take. And Viva, who had once been so strong, so sure of herself, had become lost in a sea of emotions she couldn't control. She had crossed a line she never thought she would cross, and now she was drowning. The days that followed were unlike anything Viva had ever experienced. What had begun as a fleeting moment of weakness, a single touch she hadn't pulled away from quickly, spiraled into something far more dangerous. A secret that she couldn't escape, no matter how much she tried to convince herself that it would all end soon. But as the days stretched on, it became clear. The affair had taken root, and there was no turning back. Viva, who had spent her entire life clinging to her values, her sense of right and wrong, now found herself drowning in desire. The twins, Caden and Kieran, had seen her vulnerability, and they used it to their advantage. What had started as a single night of lost control turned into a toxic relationship, one where shame was swallowed by something darker. The boys, once her beloved grandsons, were now something more, and they knew it. In those quiet moments, after the boys had left her room or when she found herself alone, the guilt would come flooding back. Memories of Jonas, her late husband, would overwhelm her. She would close her eyes and see him, the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, the laughter they had shared, the warmth of his arms, the comfort of his presence. They had been happy once, truly happy, but now that happiness seemed like a distant dream. And every time she opened her eyes, the reality of her situation crashed back in. Jonas had been everything to her. A man of strong principles, a man who had always done what was right. Viva remembered their long walks together, their quiet conversations late into the night, the way he would hold her hand and make her feel safe. But that safety had died with him, and in its place, there was only loneliness. A loneliness that had consumed her, eaten away at her over the years. And now it had led her to this. She tried to tell herself that this was temporary, that the boys would leave and it would all be over. But the more time they spent together, the more she realized that they had taken control, not just of her body but of her mind, her emotions. They knew how to manipulate her, how to keep her bound to them. They would say the right things, touch her in the right ways, and each time she would fall deeper into the trap. The relationship became a twisted game. The twins enjoyed the control they had over their grandmother, pushing her further each day. They would whisper things to her that made her feel desired, important, but it was all a lie, a manipulation designed to keep her trapped in their toxic grip. And the more Viva fell into it, the more she lost herself. The woman she had once been, the proud mother, the loving wife, was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. And yet, they were not as careful as they thought. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Secrets lurked around every corner. Neighbors would stop by occasionally, dropping in to chat or bring over something from their garden. And each time, the tension would rise. Viva would stand at the door, trying to appear calm, trying to keep her composure while the boys lingered just out of sight. Listening. One wrong word, one careless gesture, and everything could be exposed. One afternoon, as Viva chatted with her neighbor at the door, she felt the weight of the secret pressing down on her. The neighbor's cheerful conversation seemed far away, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. The twins were upstairs, their presence palpable. She knew that if the neighbor stepped inside, if she saw the look in Viva's eyes, the truth would be laid bare. And yet somehow Viva managed to keep the facade, to smile, to nod, to send the neighbor away without a second thought. But it wasn't just the neighbors. There were phone calls too. Calls from Alicia, her daughter, the boy's mother. The conversations were brief, but each one was like a ticking time bomb. Viva would answer, her voice tight, her words carefully chosen. She could hear the boys in the background, their presence a constant reminder of the secret they all shared. And every time Alicia asked how things were going, Viva would lie. She would tell her that everything was fine, that the boys were behaving, that they were enjoying their time together. But the truth was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. The twins were reckless too bold for their own good. They would walk around the house with a sense of invincibility, knowing they had their grandmother under their control. And yet, they were dangerously close to being caught more than once. There were moments when the phone would ring, when Alicia would call to check in, and the boys would laugh quietly from the other room. One of them would motion to answer, as if daring Viva to let the secret slip, but she never did. She couldn't. There were nights when Viva would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the secret suffocating her. She would think of Jonas, of how disappointed he would be if he could see her now. She would think of her daughter, of the family she had worked so hard to build, and how it was all crumbling around her. And yet, she couldn't stop. She couldn't escape the hold the boys had over her. Their secret was fragile, held together by lies and manipulation, but it couldn't last forever. The boys were careless, too sure of themselves, too confident that they had her under their thumb. Viva, once so strong, so certain, had lost all sense of who she was. Each day the tension grew, and with it, the fear that it would all come crashing down. As the days went on, the secret affair became a poison, seeping into every corner of their lives. And even though they had managed to keep it hidden for now, Viva knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And when it did, the consequences would be more devastating than any of them could imagine. There are moments in life that shatter everything we believe in. Moments that unfold without warning, where everything we hold sacred crumbles in an instant. For Alicia and Devin Evans, that moment was approaching. They had been away, far from home, trusting that their sons were safe in the care of their grandmother. But fate had other plans. Their return, early and unexpected, would reveal a truth they never could have imagined. Alicia and Devin arrived back home after a grueling trip earlier than anyone had expected. They had decided not to call ahead, wanting to surprise the family, eager to see their sons after their long absence. As they pulled into the driveway, they noticed something strange. The house was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of greeting, no rush to the door, just an eerie silence. Devin turned to Alicia, a look of concern on his face. "Where are they?" he asked. But Alicia had no answers. She stepped out of the car, her heart beginning to pound. Something wasn't right. They called out for the boys, for Viva, as they stepped through the front door. But the only response was the soft echo of their voices. The house felt still, almost abandoned. But then there it was, faint at first, barely audible. Laughter and the unmistakable sound of water running. The sound came from upstairs. Alicia's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening. She glanced at Devin, and together they made their way up the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the quiet house. As they reached the landing, the laughter grew louder, mingled with the steady rush of water. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. Alicia hesitated for a moment, confusion creeping into her mind. Why were they in the bathroom together? What was going on? Viva? Caden? Kieran? Alicia's voice was louder now, insistent, but still no response came. She could hear them. The sound of their voices mixed with the splashing water, but they hadn't heard her. The pit in her stomach deepened, an instinctive dread rising within her. She reached for the door, pushing it open with a trembling hand. The scene that greeted her on the other side of that door was one she could never have prepared for. There, in the bathroom, steam filling the air, were her sons and her mother. The three of them together in the shower, in a way that no one could misunderstand. The laughter stopped abruptly as Viva and the boys turned, their eyes wide with shock. But Alicia stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, for what felt like an eternity. Alicia could only stare, her mind refusing to process the reality of what she was seeing. Her mother, her sons. The betrayal was too much, too overwhelming. And then, everything shattered. The air in the room thickened with tension as the truth hit her like a sledgehammer. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something she could explain away. It was real. And it was happening. What the hell is going on? Alicia's voice exploded through the room, cracking the fragile silence. Her shock turned to rage in an instant. She didn't wait for answers, didn't wait for explanations. She stormed forward, grabbing Caden by the arm and yanking him out of the shower. "Get out!" Her voice was raw with fury, her hands shaking as she threw a towel at him. Kieran was next, dragged out just as forcefully. "Both of you out!" The boys stumbled from the shower, too stunned to respond. Their faces pale, water dripping from their bodies as they hurried to cover themselves. Devin stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to catch up with the horror in front of him. Alicia, however, was far from done. She turned on Viva, her voice shaking with betrayal. Disbelief. "How could you?" Alicia's voice broke as she stared at her mother, her face pale with guilt. Viva tried to speak, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the words. Alicia, it's not what you think. But Alicia didn't want to hear it. She couldn't. Not what I think. Her voice was filled with venom, her hands clenched at her sides. You were in there with my sons? The betrayal in her voice was unmistakable, the rage simmering beneath the surface, threatening to explode. Viva's words faltered, her explanation dying in her throat. There was no justification, no excuse for what had been done. Alicia's fury was uncontainable, the pain of the betrayal tearing through her. I trusted you. I trusted you with them. Her voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of anger, of loss. The family she had thought was whole, the family she had built, was now irreparably broken. Devin finally stepped forward, his voice low, strained. Get dressed, he told the boys, his tone cold, emotionless. He couldn't even look at them, couldn't bear to see what had become of his family. The boys, still dazed, hurried out of the room, their heads down, shame and confusion etched into their faces. But Alicia remained, her eyes locked on Viva. I'm sorry, Viva whispered, her voice barely audible, but the words were meaningless. Alicia's heart was too filled with rage to hear them. Sorry? She spat, her voice filled with contempt. You're sorry? You've destroyed everything. Her words hung in the air, heavy, final. There was no coming back from this. The bond between mother and daughter had been severed, the trust shattered beyond repair. Without another word, Alicia turned on her heel, her mind made up. We're leaving, she said, her voice cold and distant. And we're never coming back. She stormed out of the bathroom, her sons following behind her in silence. Viva was left standing in the steam-filled room, wrapped in nothing but guilt and regret. Alicia had said all she needed to say. The betrayal had cut too deep, leaving no room for forgiveness, no chance for redemption. Viva stumbled out of the room, the walls closing in around her. Her heart pounded with rage and disbelief. Devin followed in stunned silence, and the boys, still reeling from the confrontation, trailed behind, their heads down, not daring to speak. But behind them, in that steam-filled room, stood Viva, her body trembling, her heart shattered. Viva knew she couldn't let them leave like this. She couldn't let the last memory of her be one of betrayal and disgust. She had to make them understand. She had to make them forgive her. Her mind raced, her thoughts chaotic, as she grabbed a towel, her hands shaking as she tried to cover herself. Alicia, wait! Her voice cracked with desperation. But Alicia didn't stop. She didn't turn around. Viva's heart raced as she stumbled after them, her feet still wet from the shower, the towel clinging to her frail frame. She was losing control, her panic rising with every step they took away from her. Please, Alicia, you don't understand, she cried, her voice strained, her breathing ragged. She hurried down the hallway, her mind clouded by guilt and fear. She couldn't lose them like this. She couldn't let this be the end. By the time Viva reached the top of the stairs, Alicia and Devin were already halfway down. Their anger was palpable. We're leaving, and we're never coming back, Alicia spat, her voice cold and final. Viva's heart broke at those words. She could feel her strength slipping away, but she pressed on, her bare feet moving too quickly, too recklessly. She had to stop them. She had to make them listen. Please don't leave like this, Viva pleaded, her voice rising in panic. But the words didn't reach them. Alicia and Devin didn't turn around. They kept moving, their footsteps heavy with finality. Viva's vision blurred, her desperation overwhelming her. And as she took another step forward, her foot slipped. The wet surface of the top stair was unforgiving. Her body lurched forward, her arms flailing as she reached out for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. The fall happened in slow motion. Viva's body tumbled forward, her frail form twisting as she plummeted down the stairs. And then there was the sound, a sickening crack. The brutal sound of her head hitting the edge of the stair echoed through the house, a noise that would haunt them all forever. Time seemed to freeze as Viva's body crumpled at the base of the stairs, her fragile frame collapsing in a heap. Blood began to pool beneath her head, spreading quickly across the floor. For a moment, no one moved. Alicia, Devin, and the boys stood frozen in place, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The anger, the fury, gone in an instant, replaced by a horror so deep, so unimaginable, that it left them, paralyzed. Viva lay at the bottom of the stairs, her body motionless, her face pale. The blood slowly seeped into the cracks of the wooden floor. "Mom!" Alicia's voice was barely a whisper, her mind still refusing to believe what her eyes were seeing. She rushed down the stairs, her hands trembling as she reached for her mother. Her anger was gone, replaced by sheer terror. "Mom, no!" The words came out in a sob as she knelt beside Viva, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the blood, as she tried to wake her. Devon snapped out of his shock, moving quickly to his wife's side. His voice was tight with urgency. "Call an ambulance!" He barked at the boys, who stood frozen at the top of the stairs, too stunned to move. Caden fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed, his mind racing. Kieran, still in shock, couldn't tear his eyes away from the sight of their grandmother lying in a pool of blood, her body so still as they tried to stop the bleeding. By the time they reached the hospital, it was over. Viva was gone. The woman who had raised Alicia, the woman who had once been strong, proud, and full of life, was now a memory. Her body, frail and broken, lay still in the back seat, the last of her strength spent on those final words of regret. The family that had been torn apart by betrayal, by secrets, was now forever marked by tragedy. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. Viva's last words, "I'm sorry," echoed in Alicia's mind, but they brought no comfort. Only pain, only the realization that the mother she had loved, the woman who had raised her, was gone. The guilt would remain with them all forever. And so, in the end, it wasn't the secret that destroyed them. It wasn't the betrayal or the lies. It was the fall. A single moment of panic, of desperation, that ended with Viva's life slipping away, leaving nothing behind but the shattered remains of a family that would never be whole again. Tragedy has a way of leaving behind a wake of devastation, and for the Evans family, the fall of Viva was just the beginning. The moment her body hit the bottom of those stairs, everything changed. The home they once knew became a crime scene, the air thick with sorrow, guilt, and unspoken questions. It wasn't long before the authorities were called. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles illuminated the quiet street, casting long shadows on the broken family inside. The police arrived quickly, their presence professional, detached, as they assessed the scene. The call had been simple: an accidental fall, a head injury, but the weight of what had unfolded made it feel far more complex. As the officers moved through the house, gathering information, the family stood in silence. Alicia, her face pale with grief, watched as they asked their questions, as they examined the stairs, as they carefully avoided the growing pool of blood. The investigation was swift but thorough. The officers asked for details, how it happened, where everyone was, what led to the fall. Alicia answered their questions in a daze, her voice hollow, her mind replaying the moment over and over. Devon stood by her side, his hands clenched into fists, trying to maintain some semblance of control as he explained what had happened. The boys, too, were questioned, though their words came out in fragments, their minds still struggling to process the events that had shattered their world. Hours passed as the investigation unfolded, but it became clear to the officers that there was no foul play involved. The fall had been an accident, brought on by panic, by a desperate attempt to stop a family from fracturing any further. The blood on the stairs, the broken body at the bottom, the fractured relationships. None of it pointed to anything more than a tragic misstep. The police concluded their investigation, and the ruling was made: accidental death. There would be no charges, no further inquiry. Viva's death, as brutal and devastating as it was just that, an accident. But for the Evans family, the conclusion brought no comfort. The official report may have closed the case, but it couldn't close the wounds that had been torn open in that house. The family breakdown began almost immediately. The moment the police left, the weight of what had happened, of what had been uncovered, began to sink in. The house that had once been a sanctuary for the family now felt like a prison, each room echoing with memories of betrayal, of secrets, of loss. Alicia, once the pillar of the family, felt herself unraveling. Her mind was a storm of anger, guilt, and confusion. She had lost her mother both in the physical sense and in the moral sense, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. Alicia's relationship with her brothers had always been complicated, but now it was irreparably broken. Caden and Kieran were no longer the innocent boys she had raised. They had been complicit in something dark, something that had shattered the foundation of trust in their family. She couldn't bear to look at them, couldn't bear the weight of their shared guilt. The The sight of them reminded her of everything that had gone wrong. The mother she had trusted and the sons who had betrayed her in ways she couldn't even comprehend. Alicia made a decision that day. She couldn't stay in that house. Couldn't pretend that everything would ever be normal again. The bonds that had once tied the family together had been severed, and there was no repairing them. She packed her things, grabbed what little strength she had left, and made the only choice she could. She cut off contact with her brothers, refusing to let the toxic secret that had destroyed their family poison her life any further. But it wasn't just her brothers that Alicia had to walk away from. The weight of what her mother had done hung over her like a dark cloud. How could the woman who had raised her, the woman who had instilled in her a sense of morality, of right and wrong, have done something so unforgivable? How could Viva, her own mother, have allowed herself to fall into such a twisted relationship with her grandsons? Alicia couldn't reconcile it. She couldn't understand how the woman she had looked up to her entire life could have betrayed her in such a way. The betrayal left Alicia grappling with questions she couldn't answer. She felt torn between the love she had once had for her mother and the anger that now consumed her. She wanted to grieve, but she couldn't. Every time she thought of Viva, all she could see was the scene in that bathroom, the way her mother had looked at her sons, the way the lines between right and wrong had been blurred beyond recognition. It was as though the woman she had known had never existed at all. Alicia's heart was filled with conflict. On one hand, she had lost her mother, and that pain was undeniable. But on the other, she had lost something far more precious. The image of the woman she had trusted, the moral compass that had once guided her life. How could she mourn someone who had betrayed her so deeply? How could she move forward when everything she believed in had been torn apart? The rest of the family, too, would feel the weight of what had happened. Alicia's decision to confront her other siblings, those who had not been part of this but who would now be dragged into the aftermath, was inevitable. She couldn't keep the secret to herself. She couldn't carry the burden of what her mother had done alone. And so, one by one, she reached out to them, her voice shaking as she revealed the truth that had destroyed her family. The conversations were painful. Her siblings, shocked and horrified by what had happened, could barely comprehend it. They had loved Viva too. They had seen her as a matriarch, a figure of strength and moral guidance. And now that image had been shattered for them as well. The family that had once been united by love and trust was now fractured, each member struggling to understand how it had all gone so wrong. And so, the Evans family was left in ruins. The official investigation may have concluded that Viva's death was an accident, but the emotional fallout was far more complex. The relationships that had once held them together were broken beyond repair. The family that had once gathered around the same table, that had shared laughter and love, was now divided by guilt, betrayal, and grief. Alicia's heart would never heal completely. The weight of her mother's actions, of her brother's complicity, would remain with her for the rest of her life. She had lost more than just her mother that day. She had lost her sense of family, her sense of trust, and the foundation that had once made her feel safe. And now, as she moved forward, all she could do was try to rebuild. But no matter how far she went, no matter how much time passed, the shadow of what had happened would always linger. A constant reminder of the family that had been destroyed. In the end, it wasn't the police investigation that brought closure. It wasn't the ruling of an accident that made the family feel whole again. It was the slow, painful process of acceptance. Acceptance that some things could never be undone, that some wounds would never heal. And as the Evans family scattered, each member going their own way, one truth remained. The secret that had destroyed them would never be forgotten. Some stories don't end with simple answers. The lines between right and wrong blur until nothing is clear anymore. In this tragic tale of betrayal, desire, and despair, the Evans family was left shattered. But the real question remains. Who, if anyone, is truly to blame? Was Viva Evans a victim of her own loneliness, driven to make choices she never would have considered had her life taken a different path? Or did she willingly step into a darkness she knew was wrong but couldn't resist? Loneliness can be a powerful force. For years, Viva lived in isolation, the walls of her home closing in around her heart aching for the companionship she had lost with the death of her husband. She was vulnerable, her mind clouded by the deep sorrow of years spent alone. But does that justify what happened? Could her loneliness excuse the choices she made with her grandsons, choices that crossed every moral line? Or does it simply explain how far someone, the twins, Caden and Kieran, were not innocent either? They were young, yes, but not blind to what was happening. They could see their grandmother's vulnerability. They could feel the shift in the air, and they pushed the boundaries. What started as a playful interaction between family members became something darker, something manipulative. They weren't children. They knew what they were doing, and yet, it's hard to say how much of this was truly their fault. Did they understand the full weight of their actions? Or were they caught up in a dangerous game that spiraled out of control before they could stop it? In this story, the boundaries of morality were stretched thin, twisted by the complex emotions of each person involved. Viva, a woman who had always lived by the rules, found herself consumed by a desire she couldn't control. The twins, once innocent in her eyes, became the catalysts for her downfall. But who was the real manipulator? Who held the power in this twisted relationship? Was it the boys, exploiting their grandmother's need for love and connection? Or was Viva the one who set the stage, inviting a temptation she wasn't strong enough to resist? The tragedy of this story doesn't just lie in the fall, in Viva's death on the stairs. It lies in the psychological scars left behind. Alicia, the daughter who had once trusted her mother, now grapples with the enormity of what has happened. How can she ever reconcile the image of the woman who raised her with the one who betrayed her so deeply? The anger she feels is sharp, overwhelming, but beneath it lies a sorrow that cuts even deeper. She has lost more than a mother. She has lost the foundation of trust she built her life upon. Devon too carries the weight of this tragedy. A father, a husband, a man who thought he understood the family he was a part of, now finds himself questioning everything. His sons, once the pride of his life, are now tainted by the choices they've made. How does he move forward? How does he look at them, knowing what they've done, knowing how far they've fallen from the boys he once knew? And yet, they are still his sons. The bond of blood, of family, complicates everything. Forgiveness may seem impossible, but the heart has a way of holding on to hope, even when reason tells us to let go. And what of the twins, Caden and Kieran? Once simply boys on the verge of manhood, they now carry the burden of what they've done. Can they truly understand the weight of their actions, or are they forever marked by the choices they made in the heat of the moment? The scars of this affair will follow them for the rest of their lives, a constant reminder of how easily innocence can be lost, how quickly trust can be shattered. In the end, who is truly to blame? Is there a single person responsible for the unraveling of this family, or is it the sum of all their choices? Can we truly place blame on Viva alone, or do we have to look at the twins, at the way loneliness and vulnerability intertwine to create something so tragic? And the bigger question lingers. Is there a way forward? Can forgiveness ever be found in the wake of such a betrayal? Or has this family been torn apart forever? Perhaps there are no simple answers. Perhaps, in the end, we're left with nothing but the consequences of our choices, the weight of our decisions. And for the Evans family, those consequences are more devastating than they could have ever imagined. In the shadows of every family, there are secrets waiting to be uncovered. In the next episode, we'll explore another tale of betrayal, love, and tragic endings. Another family, another secret, and the question that haunts us all: how far can we fall before there's no way back? If you've been captivated by this story, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the next tragic tale. There are always more secrets waiting to be revealed, and more families on the brink of destruction. Join us again and be a part of unraveling the mysteries that lie hidden in the darkest corners of life. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be the first to uncover the next chilling story of betrayal and heartbreak.